They questioned her values with condescending smiles, suggesting her beliefs were outdated and naive. Her voice grew stronger with each word she spoke, as honesty and conviction turned mockery to respect. A smug talk show host thought he could ridicule Carrie Underwood, but her unexpected response silenced the entire studio, leaving him completely speechless. What happened next had everyone in tears. The studio of the Marcus Reed Show gleamed under bright lights, sleek and modern. A testament to the host's rising status in media, the air buzzed with anticipation. A mix of perfume, coffee, and the unmistakable energy of an audience ready to witness another viral moment. This wasn't just any talk show. It was a battleground where Marcus Reed had built his reputation, taking down guests with razor-sharp wit and carefully crafted gotcha questions that left conservatives stumbling over their words. The audience settled into their seats, phones ready to capture every moment. Many had come specifically for tonight's guest, Carrie Underwood, country music superstar, and one of the few openly religious celebrities who didn't shy away from her faith, a perfect target for Reed's brand of mockery. Backstage, Marcus Reed adjusted his designer tie, Italian silk, a subtle blue that brought out his eyes on camera, a gift from a designer who appreciated his politics. He skimmed through his notes, lingering on questions he'd prepared for Underwood, his lips curling into a slight smirk. This was going to be good. 5 minutes, Mr. Reed, a production assistant called, her voice tight with the nervous energy that always surrounded him before showtime. He nodded dismissively, still focused on his strategy. Carrie Underwood might have millions of fans, but in his studio, on his show, he made the rules. In her dressing room, Carrie sat quietly, no entourage of stylists fussing around her, just a simple prayer before going on stage, her habit before every performance. She wore a fitted blazer over jeans, elegant but approachable, her only jewelry a small cross necklace tucked beneath her blouse, out of sight but close to her heart. A production assistant knocked softly on her door. "They're ready for you, Ms. Underwood," Carrie smiled warmly. "Thank you, honey, and please, call me Carrie." The young woman blinked, surprised by the genuine kindness, so different from the celebrities she usually handled. "Good luck out there," she whispered. Something in her tone suggested she knew what Marcus had planned. Carrie just nodded, a quiet confidence in her eyes. "I'll be fine." The stage lights felt hot as Marcus Reed bounded out to thunderous applause. His signature entrance, high energy, arms spread wide, the perfect picture of confidence. "What's up, New York?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. The audience roared in response, already swept up in his charisma. "We've got an amazing show tonight with a guest who sold millions of records, won countless awards, and somehow still believes in fairy tales." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The first jab landed exactly as intended, subtle but pointed, setting the tone for what was to come. "Please welcome country music's golden girl, Carrie Underwood." The audience applauded, though not as enthusiastically as they had for Reed, as Carrie walked onto the stage, her smile genuine, her wave natural, not the practiced gesture of most celebrities. She moved with a quiet grace, the kind that couldn't be manufactured by PR teams. Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about her demeanor didn't fit his narrative. She was supposed to be nervous, intimidated by his reputation, but she seemed completely at ease. They shook hands, a brief moment of contact before taking their seats. The plush chairs angled toward each other, designed to create intimacy while allowing the cameras to capture every reaction. "Carrie Underwood, welcome to the show," Reed began, his voice smooth as silk. "Thank you for having me," she responded, her slight Oklahoma accent noticeable. Reed leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, a posture that looked casual to the audience but was actually calculated to create a sense of intimacy before the attack. "So, new album, tour, family, you're quite the busy woman these days," he said, his tone light, setting up the groundwork. "It's a blessing," Carrie answered, the word not lost on Reed, who caught it like a fisherman feeling the first nibble. "A blessing," he repeated, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "That's an interesting word choice," Carrie met his gaze steadily. "It's how I see it," Reed smiled, the kind that never reached his eyes. "You know, I've always been fascinated by your whole wholesome country girl image in an industry that's usually anything but." The audience chuckled, recognizing the shift in tone. the prelude to what they had come to see. "Is it an image?" Carrie asked, her question simple but direct. Reed waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, you know what I mean. The faith, the family values, the songs about Jesus." He emphasized the last word just enough to make it sound ridiculous. A couple audience members laughed nervously. "It's who I am," Carrie replied, her voice still steady, unwavering. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because I have to say, it feels a bit performative." The word hung in the air. A direct challenge. A producer offstage shifted nervously. This was more aggressive than they had planned so early in the interview, but Reed was known for going off script when he sensed vulnerability. Carrie tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "Performative how?" Reed leaned back in his chair, settling in for what he believed would be his moment to shine. "Well, let's be honest, Carrie. You're a smart businesswoman. You've built an empire selling this image of traditional values, small-town America, God and country. But you live in a mansion, travel in private jets, and move in circles that are anything but traditional." The audience tensed, some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, eager for conflict. Cameras zoomed in on Carrie's face, waiting for signs of anger, defensiveness, anything they could clip for social media later. But her expression remained calm, almost curious, as if she was genuinely interested in his perspective, not offended by it. Reed continued pressing. "Don't you think there's something a little hypocritical about that? Singing about Jesus and heaven while cashing 7-figure checks?" A woman in the front row inhaled sharply. Even for Reed, this was bold, crossing into territory that felt personal, mean-spirited. Carrie's fingers lightly touched her collar, where her cross necklace lay hidden, the gesture so subtle, most wouldn't notice. But the camera caught it, a moment of centering, of grounding herself. Reed mistook her silence for discomfort, a sign that his strategy was working. He pressed harder. "I mean, come on. In today's world, don't you think all that religious stuff is a bit outdated?" His tone now openly mocking, the audience completely silent. The trap was set. He had cornered her into either defending her faith and looking like a religious extremist or backing down and appearing insincere. Either way, he would win. The clip would go viral, another conservative voice silenced on his show. But what happened next was something neither Reed nor anyone in the audience could have anticipated. Carrie Underwood took a slow, steady breath, her eyes clear, focused, meeting Reed's gaze without wavering, and in that moment, something in the studio shifted, a tangible change in the air that left everyone watching with the sudden realization that they had severely underestimated the woman sitting in that chair, and what was about to happen next would leave them all speechless. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another. Marcus Reed's smirk remained frozen on his face, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty. He wasn't used to this. To guests who didn't immediately become defensive, who didn't take the bait. Carrie's voice when she finally spoke was soft but clear, each word measured, deliberate. "You know, Marcus, I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma. My family didn't have much, but we had faith." She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Something about her tone made everyone lean in slightly. "My mama used to tell me that how you treat people when the cameras aren't rolling says more about you than any song you could sing." The studio remained completely silent. Even the cameramen, usually shifting positions, stood perfectly still. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the conversation. "That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't really address my question about profiting from faith." He was trying to redirect, to get back to his planned attack. But Carrie just smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, genuine, without a trace of the Hollywood fakeness Reed was accustomed to seeing. "Actually, it does, because that faith isn't something I put on like these earrings or this jacket. It's not a marketing strategy. It's the foundation of who I am." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to close the distance between them. "When I was 17, before American Idol, before any success, I was singing in my church, not for money or fame, but because it filled my heart." A woman in the third row nodded silently, her eyes already glistening. "I've been blessed with success, yes, but that doesn't mean my beliefs changed. Success doesn't invalidate faith, Marcus. It tests it." Reed shifted in his chair. This wasn't going according to plan. She wasn't defensive, wasn't angry. She was composed. "But surely," he tried again, his voice sharper now, You have to admit that the whole Jesus take the wheel thing plays well with your demographic. It's good business. A few audience members frowned, the attack feeling increasingly desperate rather than clever. Carrie nodded thoughtfully. You're right about one thing. It is good business, but not for the reason you think. She paused, her hands resting calmly in her lap. People connect with authenticity. They can tell when someone means what they sing and when they're just selling something. A subtle challenge, but no one missed it, least of all Reed, whose mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Let me tell you a story that I've never shared publicly before, Carrie continued, her voice taking on a quiet intensity that drew everyone closer. 3 years ago, after a show in Chicago, a young woman waited for me backstage. She was shaking, barely able to speak when security finally let her approach. The studio was completely still now, cameramen exchanging glances, knowing they were capturing something special. She told me she wasn't religious, had never been to church, didn't share any of my beliefs, but my song had been playing on the radio the night she was planning to take her own life. A soft gasp from somewhere in the audience. Carrie's eyes never left Reed's. She said something in those lyrics gave her hope, made her call for help instead. Reed swallowed, no clever response prepared for this. That woman didn't care about my politics or whether my faith aligned with hers. She just found something real in a moment when she needed it most. Reed glanced off stage, looking for help from his producers, but they were as captivated as everyone else. So, when you ask if my faith is a performance, if it's outdated or just good marketing, I think about her and the thousands of letters I've received from people who found comfort in those songs, regardless of what they believe. The audience was completely still, many wiping away tears, others nodding along. Even some of the crew, hardened by years in television, were visibly moved. Faith isn't about private jets or mansions, Marcus. It's about having something to hold on to when life gets hard. And if my songs give that to people, then I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to do. Reed's face had lost its smug expression, replaced by something unfamiliar on him, uncertainty, maybe even a touch of shame. But he wasn't finished yet, wasn't ready to concede. That's a touching story, Carrie, really. But don't you think in today's divided world, religious messages can be exclusionary? Not everyone believes what you believe. He was trying to regain footing, to paint her as intolerant, but Carrie just nodded as if he'd made a valid point worth considering. You're absolutely right, Marcus. Not everyone believes what I believe, and they shouldn't have to. Her response caught him off guard again. Faith isn't about forcing others to see the world your way. It's about how you see the world and how that shapes how you treat people. She adjusted her posture slightly, leaning forward, her voice warm, conversational. I've performed with artists who have completely different beliefs, different lifestyles, different politics, and you know what connects us? Respect, not agreement. Reed's producer was gesturing from offstage, signaling for him to wrap it up, to cut to commercial. But Reed ignored her. Something about this conversation had become personal, more than just another gotcha moment. So, you're saying your religious views don't affect how you see others? That seems convenient. His tone had an edge now, the sound of someone desperately trying to gain the upper hand. Carrie considered his words, then shook her head slightly. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. My faith absolutely affects how I see others. It teaches me to love them, to listen to them, to respect them even when we disagree. She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. Especially when we disagree. A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. Several people applauded softly, others just nodded. The energy in the room had transformed completely. Reed hadn't just lost control of the interview. He was being genuinely outmatched in a way his audience had never witnessed before. His producer was now frantically signaling, but Reed couldn't look away, couldn't find the sharp comeback, the clever redirect. That usually came so easily to him. In the front row, a young man with purple hair and multiple piercings was nodding along with Carrie's words, his expression thoughtful, next to him. An older woman in a floral dress dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the unlikeliest of people finding common ground in the authenticity of the moment. You know, Marcus, Carrie continued, her voice gentle, not accusatory, I think sometimes we get so caught up in pointing out our differences that we forget how much we have in common. Reed's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something in her words cutting through the persona, touching the person beneath. We all want to be heard, to be respected, to be treated with kindness. Her fingers briefly touched the hidden cross at her collar. That's not a conservative value or a liberal one, it's a human one. From the back of the studio, someone started to applaud, then another person joined, and another, until the entire audience was on their feet, the sound washing over the stage in a spontaneous standing ovation. Reed sat perfectly still, his face a mixture of emotions, confusion, frustration, and something else, something that looked almost like revelation. As the applause continued, Carrie remained seated, no triumph in her expression, no smugness, just a quiet dignity that made her victory all the more powerful. This wasn't just a woman defending her faith. This was something much bigger, a moment of genuine connection in a space usually reserved for conflict and division. And as the producer finally succeeded in catching Reed's attention, frantically motioning to cut to commercial, everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something real in an industry built on performance. The cameras would soon stop rolling, the audience would eventually quiet down. But what happened next would change more than just this interview. It would shake the very foundation of Marcus Reed's carefully constructed world. We'll be right back after these messages. Reed's voice was tight, professional, but lacking its usual confidence. As the on-air sign dimmed and cameras temporarily stopped rolling, the applause continued, audience members turning to each other, some wiping away tears, others simply nodding in silent agreement. The energy in the room was unlike anything the show had experienced before. Backstage was chaos, producers huddled together, whispering urgently, scrolling through phones where social media was already exploding with clips from the interview. "What the hell was that?" Reed's executive producer hissed, storming toward him as he stepped off stage for the commercial break. She was supposed to be an easy target. Reed's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward Carrie, who remained in her seat, chatting warmly with a young production assistant who had approached her with a bottle of water. "I need 2 minutes," Reed muttered, brushing past his producer, heading toward his dressing room, the door slamming behind him. Inside, he stared at his reflection, the carefully cultivated image of the fearless TV host who never backed down, who always had the last word. But tonight something had shifted. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to regain his composure. This wasn't over. He would turn this around. Back on stage, Carrie sat quietly, seemingly unbothered by the commotion around her. A makeup artist rushed over, dabbing powder on her forehead. But there was little to fix, no nervous sweat, no smeared makeup from tears, just the same composed presence she had maintained throughout. "You're doing great," the makeup artist whispered, a break in the usual professional distance. Carrie smiled, appreciating the gesture. "Just being myself." In the control room, network executives were already calling in. The show normally aired with a slight delay, giving them time to edit if needed, but the segment was going viral in real time, unfiltered, unedited, raw. "Don't cut anything," the senior exec ordered, surprising everyone. "This is television gold, even if Reed's getting his ass handed to him." The producer hesitated. "He's got 3 more segments planned, all designed to make her look bad. Should we cancel them?" The executive considered this, then shook his head. "No, let him dig his own grave. The ratings are already through the roof." 90 seconds to air, Reed emerged from his dressing room, composed but with a hardness in his eyes. He approached Carrie as she sat waiting, the studio still buzzing with energy. "Nice performance," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. A last attempt to rattle her, to suggest her authenticity was just an act. Carrie looked up at him, her expression neither angry nor smug, just peaceful. "I'm sorry you see it that way," she replied simply. Something in her tone made Reed pause. It wasn't the defensive response he had hoped for. It was something else entirely. Compassion, not for the persona he presented, but for the person beneath it. Before he could respond, the floor director called out, 30 seconds! Reed took his seat, adjusting his tie, a nervous habit he rarely displayed. The audience had settled back in, a different energy now. They weren't waiting for blood. They were waiting for truth. And we're back in 5, 4, 3. The silent count of 2, 1, then the on-air sign illuminated, cameras rolling once more. Reed's smile returned, professional, practiced, but not reaching his eyes. "Welcome back to the Marcus Reed Show. We're here with country superstar Carrie Underwood, having quite the conversation." He tried to sound casual, as if the previous segment hadn't just upended everything. Carrie, before the break you were sharing some thoughts on faith, but I'd like to shift gears slightly. He glanced down at his notes, a prepared question designed to corner her. You've been criticized by some for not being vocal enough on certain social issues, particularly those that might conflict with your religious beliefs. The attack was shifting. If he couldn't make her faith seem fake, he would make it seem problematic. Some say your silence on these issues makes you complicit in systems of oppression. How do you respond to that? The trap was set. Another impossible position. Speak out and alienate her conservative fans, or stay silent and confirm his narrative. But Carrie again seemed unruffled. You know, Marcus, that's actually something I think about a lot. She leaned forward slightly, engaging with the question rather than deflecting it. I believe my primary calling is to make music that connects with people, that gives them hope, joy, strength in their daily lives. Reed opened his mouth to interrupt, to press harder, but Carrie continued. But I also believe that how I live my life matters more than any statement I could make on social media. The audience was silent again, hanging on her words. I support numerous charities privately, work with organizations that help women and children regardless of their background or beliefs, and try to treat everyone I meet with dignity and respect. She paused, allowing her words to settle. I've found that sometimes the loudest voices on social issues aren't always the ones making real change in people's everyday lives. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Reed shifted in his seat. But don't you think, as someone with a platform, you have a responsibility to speak out? His tone was pushing harder now, almost desperate. Carrie considered his question. I think I have a responsibility to use my platform wisely and with purpose, she said carefully. Sometimes that means speaking out. Sometimes it means taking action. And sometimes it means creating music that helps people through their darkest moments without adding to the noise of an already divided world. A woman in the audience called out, "Amen!" Others nodded in agreement. Reed's producer was frantically signaling from offstage, urging him to move to the next segment, but Reed ignored her. Something about this conversation had become personal, a challenge to everything he thought he knew. That sounds nice in theory, he said, his voice regaining some edge. But in practice, isn't it just a convenient way to avoid taking a stand? Carrie's expression remained thoughtful. I think the problem today is that we've confused taking a stand with taking sides. The simplicity of the statement landed with unexpected weight. We've reduced complex issues to sound bites and hashtags, expecting everyone to pick a team and stick to the script. Reed stared at her, the irony of her words not lost on him. The world isn't that simple, Marcus, and treating it like it is isn't helping anyone. In the control room, the executives watched in awe as viewership numbers continued to climb, social media exploding with each exchange, but not with the usual partisan reactions, with something much rarer, thoughtful reflection from across the political spectrum. She's not just beating him, one exec murmured, she's completely changing the conversation. Back on stage, Reed tried again. But surely you must have opinions on the major issues facing our country. He was grasping now, trying to find any angle that would put her on the defensive. Carrie nodded. Of course I do. We all do. But I've learned that how we express those opinions matters just as much as having them. She gestured gently toward the audience. Look at this room. People from all walks of life, different backgrounds, different beliefs, all listening to each other right now. That's rare these days, and it's valuable. Reed followed her gaze, saw the diversity of the audience, saw them nodding in agreement regardless of what they had come expecting. I guess what I'm saying is, I'd rather create spaces where different people can come together than contribute to pushing them further apart. The studio was completely still, absorbing her words. Reed sat silently for a moment, the usual rapid-fire follow-up absent. For perhaps the first time in his career, he seemed to be genuinely listening, considering, not just waiting for his chance to speak. A cameraman wiped at his eye, quickly hoping no. One noticed the floor director stood motionless, clipboard forgotten at her side. Even the most cynical staff members, hardened by years in the business, felt something shift in the room. You know, Reed finally said, his voice softer than before, almost thoughtful. I've done over 500 interviews, and I don't think I've ever had one quite like this. It wasn't what anyone expected him to say, least of all his production team, who exchanged shocked glances. Carrie smiled, a genuine warm smile. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, she replied quietly. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the carefully constructed barriers of host and guest, liberal and conservative, attacker and defender, falling away, revealing just two people in a conversation that had somehow become real, and in studios and living rooms across the country, millions watched in stunned silence as something remarkable unfolded. Not a takedown, not a viral moment of conflict, but a glimpse of what could be possible if we stopped trying to defeat each other and started trying to understand. The show would continue, but nothing would be the same after this moment, and everyone watching knew it. The next segment was supposed to be about Carrie's music, a seemingly innocent topic, but Reed's team had prepared a series of clips, selective edits of her songs and interviews, designed to paint her as out of touch, disconnected from modern culture. But as the floor director counted down to their return from the second commercial break, Reed made a decision, one that would stun his production team. "Change of plans," he muttered into his earpiece just seconds before going live. "Scrap the video package," his executive producer's voice crackled back, panic evident even through the static. "What? We can't just do it," Reed cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. The control room erupted into frantic activity. Directors and technicians scrambling to adjust the rundown on the fly. The floor director's eyes widened in surprise, but she recovered quickly, giving Reed the countdown. 5, 4, 3. The silent 2 and 1. The on-air light glowed red once more. "Welcome back to the Marcus Reed Show." Reed's voice had changed, the performative edge gone, replaced by something more authentic, more human. "We're here with Carrie Underwood, having what I can only describe as one of the most unexpected conversations of my career," the audience murmured in agreement. Some even chuckled, acknowledging the obvious understatement. Carrie smiled, a subtle expression, neither smug nor self-congratulatory, just present, fully in the moment. "Carrie," Reed continued, leaning forward slightly. "We have a segment prepared with clips and commentary, questions designed to create tension, to generate headlines." The admission was unprecedented, a host revealing the machinery behind the spectacle. The producer was gesturing wildly off stage, mouthing what looked like threats, but Reed continued. "But I don't think that's what this conversation needs." A stillness settled over the studio, the audience holding their breath, not sure what was happening, but sensing it was something significant. "Instead," Reed said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more conversational, less performative, "I'd like to ask you something real." Carrie nodded, encouraging him. "What makes you continue to believe in a world that often seems determined to reward cynicism over faith?" It wasn't the gotcha question everyone had expected. It was something else entirely, a genuine inquiry. Reed himself seemed surprised by his own question, as if it had emerged from somewhere deeper than his prepared notes. Carrie took a moment, respecting the sincerity of the question. "That's a beautiful question, Marcus," she said softly. "And honestly, some days it's harder than others." The unexpected vulnerability created an intimacy in the studio that reality TV producers spend millions trying to manufacture. "I see the same headlines you do, the same division, the same pain, the same reasons to doubt," she continued. "But I also see everyday people showing extraordinary kindness in ways that never make the news." Her eyes scanned the audience, connecting with them not as fans or viewers, but as fellow travelers. The single mom working 2 jobs who still finds time to volunteer at her church. The teenager who stands up for the bullied kid when it would be easier to walk away. The neighbor who shovels an elderly couple's driveway without being asked. Reed was listening, really listening, perhaps for the first time. "Faith isn't about ignoring the darkness, Marcus. It's about believing the light matters more." A woman in the front row wiped a tear. A man next to her reached for her hand. Strangers connected by something beyond entertainment. "And music," Carrie continued, her passion evident in every word. "Music has always been a way to speak to those moments, to remind us we're not alone in our struggles or our hopes." Reed nodded slowly. "Even when we come from different worlds?" he asked softly, almost vulnerably. "Especially then," Carrie replied without hesitation. "Because underneath all the labels, all the politics, all the things we use to separate ourselves, we share the same human heart." The cameras panned across the audience, capturing expressions of reflection, thoughtfulness, the usual hunger for conflict, replaced by something deeper, more meaningful. In the control room, network executives watched in amazement as social media metrics continued to climb, but not with the hashtags they had expected. Respectful conversation was trending. Yaupbombs, listening, matters, Carrie and Marcus. People across the political spectrum were sharing the clips, not to attack but to appreciate. A producer glanced at his phone, then looked up in disbelief. Even the competition is praising this, he murmured. On stage, Reed seemed to be experiencing a genuine moment of reflection. You know, he said after a moment, I built my career on confrontation, on creating moments where people clash, where viewers can pick a side and feel vindicated when their team wins. Carrie nodded, understanding, not judging. It's what the business rewards, Reed continued. Conflict drives ratings. Nuance doesn't sell ads. He gestured vaguely toward the cameras. At least, that's what we tell ourselves. The vulnerability was startling, coming from a man known for his armor, his impenetrable media persona. But watching you tonight, listening to you respond to questions designed to trap you or embarrass you with such grace, he seemed to search for the right word. It makes me wonder what we're really doing here, what I've been doing for the past decade. A production assistant dropped her clipboard, the soft clatter breaking the silence. No one moved to pick it up. Too transfixed by what was unfolding, Carrie leaned forward slightly. You know what I think, Marcus? Her voice gentle but clear. I think people are hungry for something real, something that doesn't divide us into teams, something that reminds us we can disagree without destroying each other. Reed nodded slowly. Maybe, he conceded, but it's harder than it looks, Carrie smiled. The most important things usually are. The audience was completely silent, witnessing something rare in modern media, a genuine human connection across the divide. The unspoken acknowledgement that beneath the performance, the politics, the personas, were just people trying to make sense of a complicated world. We have about a minute left, Reed said, glancing at the clock. Normally, I'd try to end with something provocative, a final gotcha moment to leave the audience buzzing. He shook his head slightly, a small self-deprecating smile. But instead, I'll just ask, what would you like people to take away from this conversation? Carrie considered his question. I think I'd want people to remember that it's possible to stand firm in your beliefs without standing against other people. She paused, letting the words settle. That listening doesn't mean surrendering, that respect doesn't require agreement, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just see each other as human beings first. Reed nodded, for once without a clever retort, without trying to have the last word. I think that's a message worth sharing, he said simply, as the floor director counted down the final seconds. And that's all the time we have tonight. Reed spoke to the camera, his voice carrying a new weight, a new sincerity. I want to thank Carrie Underwood for one of the most unexpected and honestly refreshing conversations we've ever had on this show. Carrie smiled warmly. Thank you for having me, Marcus. As the credits began to roll, the audience rose to their feet, not with the performative enthusiasm of a typical talk show crowd, but with a genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. A real moment in an industry built on artifice. Backstage, the chaos was immediate. Producers arguing about what had just happened. Network executives on the phone trying to make sense of the unprecedented shift. But in the midst of it all, Reed and Carrie stood together, just off camera, a moment of quiet amidst the storm. That wasn't what I expected, Reed admitted, his voice low, meant only for her. Carrie smiled. Sometimes the best conversations aren't the ones we plan. Reed nodded, considering her words. My producer is probably drafting my termination letter as we speak, he said with a small laugh, but Carrie shook her head. I doubt it. Authenticity still connects, even in this business. She held out her hand, not for the cameras, not for show, just one person reaching out to another. Thank you for listening, she said simply. Reed took her hand, a genuine handshake. Thank you for speaking, he replied. And in that simple exchange was the seed of something that would grow beyond this night, beyond this studio, beyond the clips and quotes that would circulate tomorrow. It was a reminder of what becomes possible when we speak from the heart and listen with an open mind. Something both rare and essential in a world too often divided by the very conversations meant to bring us together. The studio lights dimmed, the audience slowly filtered out. some lingering, hoping to catch a final glimpse of the unexpected moment they had witnessed. The show had ended, but the story was just beginning. Backstage was electric, producers huddled around monitors, watching social media explode in real time. "This is insane," one whispered, scrolling through her phone. "It's everywhere, and not just entertainment sites. Political blogs are picking it up too." The executive producer stood silent, arms crossed tight against her chest, her expression unreadable, watching as her carefully planned takedown transformed into something she never could have anticipated. In one corner, Reed's longtime director was already fielding calls from major news outlets seeking comment, context, anything to explain what viewers had just witnessed. Across the room, a network executive paced, phone pressed to his ear, alternating between nervous laughter and serious assurances to someone clearly higher up the chain. "Yes, sir, I understand. No. We didn't plan this. Yes, it's authentic. That's why it's hitting so hard." Reed himself had disappeared into his private dressing room, the door firmly closed. A "do not disturb" sign hastily hung. For the first time in years, he had asked for complete privacy. No assistants, no producers, no media handlers, just silence. A moment to process what had happened to him out there. Carrie was in her own dressing room, graciously thanking the makeup artist, the production assistants, the staffers who orbit celebrities, usually invisible but not to her. "You were incredible out there," a young assistant blurted, then blushed deeply, embarrassed by her unprofessional outburst. But Carrie just smiled warmly. "That's very kind of you to say," she replied, as if they were simply two women having a conversation, not a superstar and a starstruck employee. "I mean it," the assistant continued, finding courage in Carrie's gentle demeanor. "I've worked here 3 years, and I've never seen anything like that. He's never—" She stopped, catching herself, aware that criticizing the host to a guest was a fireable offense. Carrie touched her arm lightly. "Sometimes people surprise us when we give them the chance." The wisdom in her words carried more weight after what everyone had just witnessed. A production coordinator appeared at the door, knocking softly. "Ms. Underwood, there's been a change of plans." He looked nervous, papers clutched tightly in his hand. "Usually we have guests exit through the back to avoid the crowd, but there are hundreds of people gathered outside asking to see you." He swallowed visibly. "Mr. Reed has actually requested if you'd be willing to join him for a few minutes with the fans." The request was unprecedented. Guests were typically whisked away, media interaction strictly controlled, a joint appearance completely unplanned. Carrie nodded without hesitation. "Of course." Outside the studio, the night air was cool, a welcome contrast to the heat of the stage lights. People lined the barriers, phones raised, voices calling out. But not with the usual celebrity chaos, something different, more respectful, more meaningful. Reed was already there, standing somewhat awkwardly, clearly outside his comfort zone. When he saw Carrie approach, something in his expression shifted. Relief, perhaps, or maybe just appreciation for her willingness to join him in this unplanned moment. "I thought we might say hello together," he said quietly as she reached his side. "It seemed right after what happened in there." Carrie smiled, understanding. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Together they approached the barrier, the crowd's energy palpable but positive, as cameras flashed and phones recorded, capturing something rare in modern media. An unscripted, genuine moment. A woman in her 50s pushed forward slightly. "I just want you both to know," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. "I came here tonight expecting a fight. I wanted to see my side win." She gestured vaguely toward Carrie, clearly identifying with her. But what I saw instead made me remember what it feels like to actually listen to someone I thought I disagreed with. Next to her, a young man nodded, his appearance suggesting he occupied a different cultural space entirely. "Same here," he added. "I came to see Reed take down another conservative, but instead," he shrugged, almost embarrassed, "I kind of feel like we all won somehow." Reed stood silent, absorbing their words. A man who had built a career on performing outrage suddenly faced with the impact of authentic connection. Carrie moved along the line, greeting people, listening to their stories, not rushing, not performing, just present. One young woman held out a notebook, hands shaking slightly. "Could you sign this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "My sister and I, we don't agree on anything politically, but we both love your music and we both cried watching tonight's show." She gestured to another young woman standing a few feet away, looking equally moved. It's the first time in years we've felt the same way about something. Carrie took the notebook, signing it with care. Music has always been a bridge, she said, handing it back. Sometimes we just forget to listen for the harmony. Reed watched from a few feet away, witnessing the impact of genuine connection over performative conflict. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, surprised. "Turn on CNN now," the text from his producer read, followed by another. "You're trending #1 worldwide," and another. "Every network is covering this." But for perhaps the first time in his career, the metrics didn't matter. The ratings seemed distant, unimportant compared to what was happening right here, right now, in front of him. Real people, sharing real moments, connecting across the divides that his show had so often exploited. A production assistant approached, whispering urgently, "Sir, we need to get you both back inside. The networks are requesting live interviews, statements. Everyone wants to know what happened in there." Reed looked at Carrie, who was still engaged with a group of fans, listening to their stories, responding with genuine interest. "Tell them we'll be available tomorrow," he said firmly. "Tonight's about this, these people, this moment." The assistant blinked, surprised, but nodded, rushing off to relay the message. Behind them, inside the studio building, executives and producers were already planning how to capitalize on what had happened, how to package it, market it, turn it into the next big media moment. But out here in the cool night air, something more important was happening, something real, in an industry built on illusion. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Reed and Carrie found themselves standing alone for a moment, away from the cameras, away from the audience, just two people who had shared something unexpected. "I had an entire segment planned," Reed admitted. "Questions designed to make you look intolerant, close-minded, out of touch." He shook his head, the admission clearly difficult for him. "I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've never scrapped a segment mid-show before." Carrie listened without judgment. "What changed your mind?" she asked simply. Reed considered the question. "Something you said about authenticity, about performance versus reality." He gestured vaguely, struggling to articulate the shift. "I just couldn't keep pretending that tearing people down was somehow making the world better." Carrie nodded, understanding. The hardest conversations to have are sometimes the most important ones. Reed laughed softly. "My producer is currently deciding whether to fire me or nominate me for an Emmy." They both smiled at that, the absurdity of the industry they both navigated in different ways. "Whatever happens next," Carrie said, "you created a space tonight where people could hear each other, really hear each other. That matters." A car pulled up nearby, Carrie's ride ready to take her away. But before she turned to leave, she reached out, touching Reed's arm lightly. "Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just be honest about our questions instead of pretending we have all the answers." Reed nodded, absorbing her words. "Thank you," he said simply. No clever comeback, no witty retort, just genuine gratitude. As she walked toward her waiting car, Reed remained standing there, a man at a crossroads. The path ahead unclear, but somehow more meaningful than the road that had led him here. His phone continued to buzz, messages pouring in. Everyone wanted a piece of the moment, an explanation, a quote, a follow-up interview. But for now, he just stood there, watching as Carrie's car pulled away, contemplating what had just happened and what might come next. A production assistant approached tentatively. "Sir, the network president is on the line. He says it's urgent." Reed nodded, the real world rushing back in. He knew tomorrow would bring questions, scrutiny, analysis. The media machine would dissect every moment, every word, every look, trying to package something authentic into something consumable. But for tonight, for this moment, he had experienced something real. And no matter what came next, that couldn't be taken away. As he turned to head back inside, a text message appeared on his phone from an unknown number. "Thank you for listening. Carrie." 3 simple words, but they carried the weight of something profound, something transformative, something true. By morning, the interview had become more than just a viral moment. It was a cultural touchpoint, something people referenced, shared, and discussed in ways that transcended the usual celebrity news cycle. The major networks ran highlights, political commentators weighed in, social media feeds overflowed with clips, quotes, and reactions. But what made this different was how it crossed boundaries. Liberal outlets praised Carrie's grace under pressure. Conservative platforms celebrated her unwavering faith, but both sides acknowledged something deeper had occurred, something that challenged the very nature of public discourse. Reed woke to his phone buzzing incessantly, hundreds of notifications, texts, calls, emails. The night before, he had turned it off, needing space to process what had happened on his show. But now, reality demanded attention. His executive producer had called 17 times, the network president 5, even competitors were reaching out, offering exclusive interviews. The story had legs, but not the kind anyone had expected. He scrolled through headlines, his name paired with Carrie's everywhere. Marcus Reed and Carrie Underwood show America how to disagree. Unexpected moment of unity on late-night television. What Reed and Underwood can teach us about listening, and his personal favorite from a major conservative outlet that had criticized him for years. Reed shows courage in vulnerability, a lesson for all media. Not a single headline mentioned winners or losers, takedowns or ownage. The usual vocabulary of conflict had been replaced by something more nuanced, more thoughtful. Across town in her hotel suite, Carrie was experiencing something similar. Her publicist had arrived early, armed with a thick folder of press clippings, interview requests, statements to approve. "This is unprecedented," the woman said, barely containing her excitement. "Everyone wants to talk to you, not just entertainment shows, major news networks, political programs. Even universities are calling, asking if you'd speak about civil discourse." Carrie sat quietly, sipping her morning tea. "That's not why I went on the show," she said softly. "I was just there to be myself, to share my music, my faith." The publicist nodded quickly. Of course, but this opportunity is enormous. We could really capitalize on this moment." Carrie looked up, meeting her gaze. "I think that's exactly what we shouldn't do." Her voice was gentle but firm. "The reason last night resonated is because it wasn't strategic. It wasn't packaging faith or values for public consumption. It was just real." The publicist hesitated. "But your platform, your influence, it's expanded overnight." Carrie smiled. "And the best way to honor that is to stay true to why it happened." She set her cup down. "I'll do select interviews, but not as a victory lap, not as someone who won a debate, only if the conversation can continue what began last night." Across the media landscape, something unusual was happening. The interview was being discussed not as entertainment, but as a case study in something society had been missing. "What struck me," a prominent political analyst said on air, "wasn't just what they said, but how they listened to each other. When was the last time we saw that on television?" His co-panelist nodded. "We've become so accustomed to people talking over each other, scoring points, performing outrage, that we've forgotten what real conversation looks like." In university classrooms, the clip was already being shown. Communication professors using it to illustrate effective dialogue. Conflict resolution experts pointing out how Carrie had de-escalated tension without sacrificing her position. "Notice how she never takes the bait," one professor told her students. "She responds to the underlying question, not the provocation wrapped around it." Meanwhile, at the network, an emergency meeting was underway. Executives, producers, legal teams, all trying to determine what this meant for the Marcus Reed show. "The numbers are beyond anything we've seen," the head of analytics reported. "Not just viewership, but engagement, shares, comments, follow-up, and the demographic spread is unprecedented. We're reaching audiences who typically avoid our programming entirely." The network president leaned forward. "So, the question is, do we treat this as a one-off phenomenon, or do we pivot the entire show?" Reed sat quietly at the end of the table, listening as others debated his future, his brand, his identity, until finally he cleared his throat. "If I may." The room fell silent, everyone turning toward him. "For 10 years, I've built a career on being the smartest person in the room, on having the quickest comeback, the sharpest take. It made for good TV, it drove ratings, engagement, all the metrics we value." He paused, looking around the table at faces that had celebrated his most viral takedowns, his most provocative moments. "But last night, I experienced something different, not just a good TV moment, but a genuinely meaningful exchange, and I can't go back to performing outrage just because it's good business." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The network president studied him. "What exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" Reed took a deep breath. "A show that creates space for real conversation, that values listening as much as talking, that doesn't reduce complex issues to simplistic talking points or people to caricatures of their beliefs." A senior executive scoffed. "That sounds lovely, but conflict drives engagement. Civility doesn't sell ads." Reed nodded, acknowledging the reality. "Except last night proved that's not always true. Last night showed that authenticity, even uncomfortable authenticity, resonates in a way performative conflict doesn't." He gestured toward the analytics report. "And the numbers back that up." Across town, Carrie was in a quiet studio, recording a short video message for her social media followers. Not surrounded by the usual team of publicists, stylists, media coaches, just her faith, her words. "I want to thank everyone for all the kind messages about last night, but this isn't about me or Marcus Reed or who won a conversation." Her eyes were clear, direct, honest. "It's about remembering that behind every opinion, every belief, every disagreement, are real people with real stories. And when we take time to listen, really listen, something beautiful happens." She touched the cross around her neck, no longer hidden beneath her collar. "My faith teaches me that love matters more than winning, that understanding matters more than proving a point. And last night reminded me that sometimes the most powerful thing we can share with someone isn't our opinion, but our attention." Her words spread quickly, not with the usual celebrity viral speed, but with something deeper, more meaningful. People sharing it not to signal tribal affiliation, but because it spoke to a hunger for connection across divides. By mid-afternoon, something unexpected happened. Reed's publicist received a call from Carrie's team. A simple question. Would Reed be interested in a joint interview? Not to rehash the viral moment, but to continue the conversation they had begun, to model what respectful dialogue looks like even between people with different views. Reed didn't hesitate. Yes, the interview was scheduled, not on his show, not on any platform that either controlled, but on neutral ground. A respected journalist known for depth over drama would moderate. The news spread quickly, creating anticipation. Not for conflict, but for connection. That evening, as Reed sat in his apartment, away from the noise, the hot takes, the analysis, his phone buzzed with a text from Carrie. "Nervous about tomorrow?" He smiled, typing back, "Terrified. Much easier to argue than to listen." Her response came quickly. "Truth is always harder than performance, but it's the only thing that really matters." He stared at those words from someone he had planned to ridicule just 24 hours earlier, someone whose faith he had dismissed, whose values he had targeted. And yet, here she was, still extending grace, still choosing connection over combat. Reed set his phone down, walked to the window, looked out at the city lights, and for the first time in years, felt something that had been missing from his life, his work, his purpose: clarity. Not the clarity that comes from having all the answers, but the clarity that comes from being willing to ask better questions, to listen to the answers even when they challenge you, especially when they challenge you, because sometimes the most important conversations aren't the ones that confirm what we believe, but the ones that invite us to see beyond our own perspective, to recognize that even across the deepest divides, our shared humanity runs deeper still. The venue chosen for their joint interview was symbolic in its simplicity. Not a flashy network studio with dramatic lighting and sleek furnishings, but a community theater in downtown Manhattan. Intimate, neutral, unpretentious. A space where art and conversation had coexisted for decades. The audience was carefully selected. Not the usual mix of fans and tourists eager for celebrity sightings, but a diverse cross-section: teachers, ministers, community organizers, students, activists, social workers, people committed to building bridges rather than fortifying walls. As Reed waited backstage, he could hear the soft murmur of voices, a different energy from his usual shows. No chants, no applause signs, no warm-up comedians priming the crowd for conflict and drama. Just people gathering with genuine curiosity about what might unfold. In a small room nearby, Carrie sat quietly, no entourage surrounding her. Just a simple prayer, a moment of centering herself in what mattered most. When a production assistant appeared to let her know they were ready, she nodded, thanking the young woman by name. "Are you nervous?" the assistant blurted. then immediately blushed, embarrassed by her unprofessional question. But Carrie just smiled. "A little," she admitted. "The most important conversations are usually the ones that make us vulnerable." The assistant nodded, something in Carrie's words resonating with her own experience. "Well, everyone out there, they're really here to listen, not just watch, if that makes sense." Carrie's smile deepened. "That makes all the difference." The moderator, Emma Chen, was respected across political lines, known for her depth, her fairness, her commitment to substance over spectacle. As the lights dimmed, she walked onto the stage. No dramatic entrance, no flashy introduction. Just a woman with a purpose. "Good evening," her voice warm but measured. "Tonight isn't about debate or discussion or even dialogue in the usual sense." She looked out at the attentive audience. "It's about something we've nearly forgotten in our public discourse. The art of listening, of genuine curiosity, of being willing to sit with discomfort rather than rushing to comfortable conclusions." She gestured toward the side of the stage. "Please welcome Carrie Underwood and Marcus Reed." The applause was respectful, appreciative but subdued, not the raucous greeting of entertainment, but the thoughtful welcome of engagement. They entered from opposite sides of the stage, meeting in the middle, shaking hands before taking seats arranged in a small semicircle. No desk between them, no physical barriers, just three people preparing for conversation. "Thank you both for being here," Emma began. "I think it's fair to say that what happened on your show, Marcus, has resonated beyond what anyone expected." Reed nodded. "I think that's because it wasn't planned. It wasn't packaged. It was just real." He glanced at Carrie, a small smile of acknowledgement. "And in media today, reality is actually pretty rare." Emma turned to Carrie. "You went into that interview knowing the format of the show, knowing what typically happens to guests, especially those with conservative values. What made you say yes?" Carrie considered the question. "I believe in meeting people where they are, not just where I wish they would be." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying to every corner of the theater. "And sometimes the most important conversations happen in the least comfortable places." Emma nodded. "Marcus, I have to ask, what changed that night? You had a plan, a script essentially. What made you abandon it?" Reed shifted slightly, the vulnerability still unfamiliar, but somehow necessary. "I think I had a moment of clarity about the difference between performing and actually communicating." He looked out at the audience, making eye contact, nothing rehearsed in his expression. "For years, I've built a career on creating moments that confirm what my audience already believes, that make them feel righteous in their opinions, intelligent in their judgments." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped actually listening to anyone who disagreed with me. They became props in a performance, not people with their own truths." A murmur ran through the audience, recognition perhaps of something many had experienced but few had articulated. "Carrie," Emma continued, "there's been some criticism that you were too nice, that you should have challenged Marcus more directly, called out his tactics. What do you say to that?" Carrie smiled, the question clearly one she'd anticipated. "I think that criticism assumes the goal was to win an argument, to defeat someone, but that was never my intention." She adjusted slightly in her chair. "My goal wasn't to change Marcus's mind. It was simply to speak my truth with as much grace and clarity as possible." She glanced at Reed. No triumph in her expression, just genuine warmth. "What happened after that wasn't up to me." Emma nodded, turning back to Reed. "Has this experience changed you, professionally, personally?" Reed didn't answer immediately. The old habit of quick responses replaced cross-section. Teachers, ministers, community organizers, students, activists, social workers. People committed to building bridges rather than fortifying walls. As Reed waited backstage, he could hear the SOF by something more thoughtful. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted. "But I know I can't go back to treating complex issues like sporting events, with winners and losers, teams to cheer for, teams to boo." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I built my brand on being right, on having the perfect takedown, the viral moment. But I'm starting to realize there's something more valuable than being right." "What's that?" Emma asked softly. "Being honest," Reed replied, "about what we know, what we don't know, what we fear, what we hope for." The audience was completely silent, absorbing his words. "Carrie," Emma turned, Your faith has always been central to your music, your message, but it's also often been used to create division in our culture. How do you navigate that tension? Carrie nodded, acknowledging the complexity. I think we've confused disagreement with disrespect, difference with division. Her fingers lightly touched the cross at her neck. My faith teaches me that love must come first, before judgment, before politics, even before being right. She gestured gently toward Reed. What happened on Marcus's show wasn't about finding perfect agreement. It was about finding common humanity despite our differences. Throughout the theater, people nodded, some wiping away tears, others simply listening with rare, undivided attention. The beautiful thing about truth, Carrie continued, is that it doesn't need defending. It just needs living, day by day, moment by moment, in how we treat each other, especially those we disagree with. Emma let the words hang in the air, giving them space to settle before asking her next question. Where do we go from here? Both of you individually, but also collectively as a culture that seems to have forgotten how to talk to each other. Reed leaned forward. I've spent a decade perfecting the art of the takedown. I don't have easy answers for how to build up instead. He glanced at Carrie, then back to the audience. But I'm committed to trying, to creating spaces for conversation, not just conflict, for questions, not just conclusions. Carrie nodded. And I think that's all any of us can do. Take the next right step, speak truth with kindness, listen with genuine curiosity, and remember that behind every opinion, every belief, every position is a person with a story worth hearing. As the conversation continued, something remarkable happened, not just on stage, but throughout the theater. People began to truly listen, not just waiting for their turn to speak, not just looking for points to refute, but absorbing, considering, allowing themselves to be changed, not in their core convictions perhaps, but in how they held them, how they expressed them, how they engaged with difference. By the time Emma brought the evening to a close, no one was checking their phones, no one was shifting impatiently, the usual restlessness of audiences replaced by a rare collective presence. I want to thank you both, Emma said simply, for reminding us what conversation, genuine conversation, can look like. The applause that followed wasn't the typical celebrity adulation. It was something deeper, more meaningful, recognition of something essential that had been demonstrated, not just discussed. As people filed out of the theater, conversations continued. Strangers sharing perspectives, finding unexpected common ground, not in their conclusions, but in their shared humanity. Backstage, Reed and Carrie stood together, away from cameras and microphones, just two people who had experienced something neither had expected. Thank you, Reed said simply, for showing me a different way. Carrie shook her head gently. I think we showed each other, she replied, and maybe that's what we all need most. Not winners and losers, just fellow travelers willing to walk together, even on different paths. As they parted ways that evening, neither knew exactly what would come next, how this moment would reshape their work, their purpose, their impact, but both understood something fundamental had shifted, not just in their public personas, but in their understanding of what truly matters in a world so often divided by the very conversations meant to bring us together.